you very much. I have a tendency to move around a lot when I speak, so I don't spend a lot of time in front of a microphone, but having a background as a trainer, I've learned to be able to talk over the top of football teams. But if by any chance I get too soft, please yell out and I'll come back to the microphone. So there are just a couple of things that I want to say before I start this presentation. Our speaker just before, Lynn, was talking about her use of diplomacy in the presentation that she was gave. So if you want to find out what real diplomacy looks like, welcome to a presentation by the Victorian Auditor-General's office. The second thing that I want to say is what Lynn talked about very, very accurately, auditors coming into the office and saying nobody likes to be audited. Auditors make people's lives a living misery. Records managers tend to be one of the few groups of people that actually don't hate audits. And as we saw, audits often tend to have very, very positive outcomes for records managers, often because the findings aren't so positive. And hopefully this is a similar story. And the third thing that I wanted to say is I noticed that we have Judith Ellis in the audience with us today. Sorry if I'm embarrassing you, Judith. But I also wanted to point out that Judith played a huge role in this audit in a way, because Judith was a lecturer when I went for my master's degree in information management and technology, and I actually had a completely different career in mind, but became so fascinated with records management and so passionate about the importance that it plays in private and public sector integrity, that it led to the work that I did at PROV, which led me to VAGO, which led to this very audit. So I wanted to just take a moment and tip my hat. This is very much something that's attributable to you as well. So now I'll get into it. So this is just a bit of an outline. I won't need to go through it, just a little bit about my background, the background of the office, and our powers of access to information, and then the audit itself. This is me. And I tell people that this is a little bit what I looked like just before I joined the audit office. And so in giving you this background, the reason why I wanted to do that is one of the common things that we're told as auditors, and having been an auditor for almost a decade now, almost the first thing that you hear when you go into an organisation is you won't understand what we do. You won't have an understanding. You don't know the context that we work in. You don't know the business that we do, and therefore you're not really in a position to understand how we work. I was in a position to understand how information management works. So I just wanted to give that reassurance, and also because I know in this presentation I'm speaking to the choir who have that same understanding. So that's me. And yes, that's what I looked like shortly before I joined VAGO. Talking a little bit about the public sector. People often don't realise what a huge body it is. And if we thought about it in terms of being a corporation, it would be a massive corporation. And hence it would get, naturally, a huge amount of public interest. We've got a revenue of around $53 billion, assets of around $200 billion, and around 260,000 employees. Eat that, Google. Not so diplomatic, sorry, VAGO. Talking about Victoria's integrity system and where VAGO sits in this. So this is just a little bit of a stock standard picture that we give, or a graphic that talks about independent bodies that monitor public sector integrity. So what we mean by that is things like setting standards of conduct, investigating corruption, and especially what VAGO does, holding government to account for the work that it's doing. And so you've got a little picture of, the public, who I have always said are, at the end of the day, the bosses, because they choose the government. They choose the politicians. Then you've got all the integrity officers, for which VAGO is in there. You have the executive government, and you have your agencies. And so the role that VAGO plays is as an integrity office in that sort of framework. Answering the question of why Victoria has an Auditor-General, our key or primary reason is to provide assurance to the Parliament And this actually should say, and I could have sworn that I changed it, and I'm not sure if someone changed it back, but it's to provide assurance to the Parliament and to the public, to the community, to the public, on the accountability and performance of the Victorian public sector. How we fulfil that mandate is under the Audit Act. So we have our own piece of legislation that we need to adhere to, and it's got rules and regulations and requirements longer than I am tall, which actually I should have chosen a taller person, but pretty long. We work independently of Parliament, and sometimes agencies actually don't quite understand that. Now, what that means is that our office is not subject to direction. It's not subject to ministerial direction. Ministers cannot come to us and say, we want you to look there, but don't look there. We want you to talk about this, but not about that. At the end of the day, absolute discretion is with the Auditor-General about what we look at and what we don't, and what we say and what we don't. And in other presentations, I might sometimes go like this, that this is not being video recorded, just to explain that what that means is we cannot be told what to do. What we do is examine the activities of around 500 entities. And in performance audit, there are around 50 of us. So that's why I tell people that's what I used to look like before I joined VAGO. A big part of what we do, and the most important part of what we do, is to report on what we find without fear, without favour, and without affection. So, you know, it's like that point in legal movies where they say, I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me, whoever. Without fear, without favour, and without affection. And sometimes that makes us friends, and sometimes that us being VAGO, sometimes that makes VAGO friends, and sometimes that makes VAGO enemies, and sometimes it makes it anywhere in between. But our job is to be independent and impartial at all times. So, for those who aren't familiar with how audits work, and I'm going to be really honest now and say, before I joined the audit office, I didn't really have an understanding of how audits work, but found out real quick. There are two types of audit. There's financial audit and performance audit. And financial audit is somewhere where I will never work, because I explain to people that any time I get past 6, I start to get a little bit confused. So there are no career aspirations in financial audit for me. But then there's performance audit. So financial audit is looking at how is the money spent? Where did the money go? Can you show what came from that money? Performance audit looks at what was achieved for that money spent. What were the outcomes? What benefits were gained? In order to answer these types of questions, under our legislation, we are given really wide powers of access and examination. And I'm about to talk about that now. If I'm talking too fast for anyone, also just let me know. I tend to talk really fast when I get really excited. And this is slow for me. So this is usually as slow as I can get it. Under our Act, we have something called Section 11. And this gives VAGO the power to compel individuals to provide documents, the power to search for and take copies of any document in an agency's or authority's possession, custody or control, and examine individuals and take evidence under oath. And not a lot of people actually know that, but we can take evidence under oath. Section 12 removes secrecy obligations imposed by legislation, rule of law, or cabinet processes. So we have access to a level of record, a level of evidence and documentation that most people don't, which puts us in a position to be able to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So these powers, also what's really important to understand in telling this story, is that they can be exercised at any time where they relate to our functions or our powers under the Act. So if we are doing our job, those powers apply. They're not contingent on agency approval. So when we're doing an audit, when we go into an organisation and we say, I'd like to have a copy of that, thanks, the agency doesn't get to say, yeah, let me check with my, no, give it. Give it. It's not confined to audit conduct, so it's not confined to when we're physically on site, in the middle of an audit. So it also includes annual planning and audit planning. So when we're planning for the future, if we say, we think there's a risk of this or that, we think there's trouble on this horizon, we're allowed to ask, or we're allowed to make the request and access information to tell us more about that, so that we can make informed decisions and recommendations to the Auditor-General about where we should be using our limited funds and our limited resources. As I said, there's 50 of us and around 500 odd organisations. So we've got a lot of people to look at in little time. We want to make the best use of the time and the people that we have. So by accessing this information, it allows us to make recommendations to the Auditor-General about where we should and shouldn't focus our work. And it also is not confined to open public records. And I'm pretty much sure I don't have to explain to anybody here the difference between open and closed public records. It includes cabinet in confidence, it includes commercial in confidence, it includes anything. Secrecy obligations are removed for anything that we need to look at. So now I'm going to talk about the audit and get to what was really important about this. And that's just a link if you need to get to it. Access to public sector information, a really, really important aspect of records management, where I truly believe we got to tell the story of the importance of records management at what happens at the other end. So as Lynn was talking about, you know, the rough enough is good enough system, great going in, but what happens at the other end can be an absolute catastrophe. So what was important was to first define what public sector information is. And once again, I know I'm speaking to the choir here. All of the information generated, collected and funded by or produced for government. And we're talking about state government naturally in this situation. So this includes structured data, so data sets and databases, and unstructured data, which surprised a number of people not in the RMIM industry. So reports, emails, briefings, photos, and people said, emails? Emails? But emails aren't records. Emails aren't PSI. Emails, you want to access emails? And we said, give it. Literally, give it. I would get into trouble for saying that at work, so don't tell anyone. Seriously, don't tell anyone. In 2009, I don't know whether all of you know this, but there was an inquiry, a state parliamentary inquiry, called the EDIC inquiry. Now, it was a big inquiry about how to get better access and better use of public sector information. And it was very big and had a lot of things in it. And very specifically, government made some commitments in response to the recommendations that were made. So including an open access approach to all Victorian PSI. Remember what I said before about what constitutes PSI and people saying the emails aren't records. Interesting. Implementing a mandatory information management framework for all PSI and a standardised method for categorising, storing and managing PSI, and only restricting access where it's required by law, contract or state security. So understanding that there certainly are instances, there are times when restriction is required. It by no means was trying to say access to everything at every time. Understanding that there are situations nobody's going to want to put on the internet where to hide the most important people in the event of a terrorist attack. I think everyone can agree that's not going to be something that's in the public interest and anyone's interest. So understanding that there are situations where information shouldn't be made available to the public. But also agencies, and this becomes really important, agencies publishing comprehensive information asset registers, which allow people, the public and other organisations to understand what agencies have in their possession. So not just what they've made available on their websites or what they've made available through some other means, but what they have. And also providing a whole of government directory for PSI. I'm going to speed this up. The objective was to examine whether agencies were effectively facilitating access to PSI and also looking at whole of government leadership and oversight and whether it supports improved performance in facilitating access to PSI. So you can see we looked at a whole bunch of organisations that had responsibilities and roles in terms of whole of government and in terms of agencies who need to do a lot of work around providing access to PSI. And here's the conclusion. Agencies examined are not providing the public with full and open access to the information to which they are entitled. Why? Well, neglected critical foundation of comprehensive and sound IM practices. Rough enough is good enough. Absolute critical to being able to provide good access. So what does that mean? Agencies first need to understand what they have and manage what they have before they can provide access to it. When an agency isn't even sure what they have, how can they provide any assurance that they're effectively providing access to it? We also found that whole of government leadership and governance of IM failed to drive the significant cultural and operational changes needed to achieve an open access approach. And I don't think there's anybody in this room who wouldn't understand what we mean when we say significant cultural and operational changes. But, and I may have the date wrong, so please do correct me if I've got it wrong, Justine. Since 2011, under the Public Records Act, and this is fairly clear, public records must be captured in systems and formats that preserve their integrity while facilitating their use. I'm pretty sure that access and use kind of go together. You've got to be able to access something before you can use it. So it includes attachment of metadata to records so they can be located, retrieved, presented, and interpreted. Some of the findings: not effectively managing PSI, whole of government leadership oversight, weak and inadequate. There's no whole of government PSI directory, we all know that. This one I found to be particularly interesting. DPC has never, and the red is because I actually put that in, which was not necessarily in the diplomatic vein of VAGO. DPC has never published a register of cabinet decisions, despite the fact that this is required by law. Required by law. There is no consistent way to determine what PSI should be restricted from public access, even within organisations, let alone consistency across organisations and across departments. So even within an organisation, there's no sort of common agreement. And there is a false general perception that if PSI is restricted from general public access, and I talked before, where there are certainly instances where public access should be restricted. But there's a general perception that even when it should be restricted from access, agencies don't have to let the public know that it exists. And this is incorrect. This is absolutely false. So we found agencies do not manage comprehensive PSI asset registers. They fall well short of compliance with Part 2 of the FOI Act. And instead, they often point to their websites. And there's a bunch of reasons there why websites aren't necessarily, so I'm not speaking in totality here, but aren't necessarily always the best way to ensure that access is being appropriately facilitated. You have to rely on things like people understanding how to navigate websites, people having an understanding of what things might be called, an understanding of classification systems. It requires a lot of the person who is trying to access the information rather than the agency doing everything within their capability to make sure that information can be found. There are also instances where they might be exempt from open access, so excluded from publications listings. So how would somebody know, just say you're a university researcher working on a master's or a PhD, how are you going to know that perhaps a pivotal piece of information exists to which you may be entitled to see if you're working on particular research? You may have a legitimate cause for accessing it, but how are you to know that it even exists if the agency feels that they don't have to let you know that it exists? They may be able to say, we're not giving you access to it, but we need to let you know that it exists. So someone seeking a specific PSI access may not know its title. We know this, and we know that websites are becoming increasingly complex and multi-layered. Having looked at a number of different agency websites as part of this audit, I almost became blinded by the level of drill down that some agencies have. And it becomes time-consuming, frustrating, and difficult for a person who likes to say, give it. So what happened? We had the EDIC inquiry. The EDIC inquiry was pretty clear. We had the government making commitments to improve things, which were pretty clear. And yet we have a situation where this hasn't been the case. What happened? Well, after the EDIC inquiry, government commenced developing a whole-of-government IMF through a cross-government project board. And this becomes really interesting. And the reason why I've got a page reference is just in case anybody comes back and say, I don't believe you that this was in the report. Once developed, DTF assumed a responsibility for the IMF, then informed government that its scope had been narrowed and the original goals of transparency and accountability had been removed. And that response is exactly why I put a page reference. I'm starting to run out of time. Government signed off on these changes, and the IMF essentially was never implemented. The audit notes that, and this is particularly important, the audit notes that DTF's advice to government in relation to making these changes was manifestly inadequate, with no discussion of the likely consequences of the revised scope for what it was intended to be. So overall, what we said that the current system is in a state of disarray, which I'm pretty sure is no big oh my God moment for any of you guys, where we're not confident that agencies understand what PSI they hold, and we are certain, so VAGO as an office, we are certain that they are not providing the public with the means to request this information. There is a confused governance environment with multiple and uncoordinated information management requirements, and I think that's, oh, is that me? That was VAGO listening in and being unhappy with me. I'm sorry. With multiple and uncoordinated IM requirements, and we know that that's fairly clear. And currently the absence of a rigorous approach to managing information, blah, 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 has significant implications for public access and the sharing of information across government. Now, thinking of this, and I am now genuinely speaking a little out of school, but thinking about the implications that this has in today's society where we rely so much on interoperability and the sharing of information, the sharing of data, being able to link data to understand things like wicked problems, to find solutions to problems that are becoming more complex, more dangerous, more severe, with catastrophic implications for society. Significant implications almost doesn't speak severely enough. Significant is not an adequate word, and that was speaking out of school, so I'm not really always great with the diplomatic stuff. That may have been a former employer, I'm not sure. So the recommendations that we made was that DPC works with agencies that have whole of government IM responsibilities, and in consultation with the wider public sector to develop a whole of government IM framework. That applies to all forms of PSI. It's underpinned by appropriate legislation. And so we're all quite aware of what we mean by appropriate legislation. We've got FOI legislation, we've got the Public Records Act, we have CPDP's Act. We've got a raft of legislation that together could build such a framework that includes effective implementation, governance and monitoring arrangements. So as I talked about in the presentation, in response to the 2009 EDIC inquiry, government started by having a cross-government project management team that was designed to do this with governance processes. Talking about implementation and monitoring, this becomes so important in any large-scale project to make sure something moves along properly and incorporates the data release requirements of DTF's data Database access policy. More recommendations. We made more, but wait, there's more. That agencies implement better IAM principles and standards for PSI asset custodianship and governance. That agencies assess their own IAM maturity using the PROV IAM maturity measurement tool, which we all know is IAM3, to determine what improvements they need and implement a plan to achieve this. And that IAM governance bodies implement oversight programs that include FOI management and provide assurance that staff are complying with IAM policies and procedures. And that agencies review and improve their compliance with Part 2 of the FOI Act. So Part 2, as I talked about in the presentation before, I may have been a bit quick, was providing what would be the equivalent today of an information asset register, so that people, other agencies, the public can understand what it is that an agency has that they may want to see. And to develop a proactive PSI release program using comprehensive PSI asset registers as a core tool for release decisions in accordance with the IAM governance standard.